On a stormy March night in 1847, the stillness of Pennsylvania County was shattered by cries said to come from the Rutherford plantation, sounds that would linger in local memory for generations. What began as a simple poker game among wealthy tobacco planters spiraled into a wager so shocking, so morally corrupt, that officials erased every trace of it from public record for more than a century. The gamble wasn't about land or fortune. It was about people, and when the final card fell, the fallout spread like wildfire through Virginia's elite, leaving behind unexplained deaths, ruined estates, and a silence enforced by the state's most powerful men. The Rutherford estate, known as Thorngate Manor, was the jewel of the region, with more than 3,000 acres of fertile soil along the Rappahannock River. Its master, Colonel Harrison Rutherford, was a 43-year-old planter whose influence stretched from county courts to railroad boards, and whose wealth made him one of Virginia's most respected voices on trade and politics. Yet for all his power, his pride centered on his daughter, Margaret, barely 18, celebrated for her beauty, intellect, and refined talents that drew suitors from the Commonwealth's most prominent families. Behind the grandeur, however, the plantation's success depended on nearly 200 enslaved laborers. Among them, Caesar Wellington, a man who defied the rigid boundaries of slavery. Caesar, born on the estate, had secretly learned to read and later revealed an uncanny skill with numbers. Rather than punish him, Harrison recognized his value and entrusted him with managing accounts and advising on investments, a decision that raised eyebrows among neighbors, but made the plantation even more profitable. That unorthodox relationship blurred lines of power and dependency in ways few could admit. And it set the stage for the terrible night when cards, pride, and human lives collided in a game whose consequences still haunt Virginia's history. Caesar lived in unusual comfort for someone in bondage, occupying a modest but well-kept room in the main house instead of the slave quarters. Harrison often turned to him, not just for accounting, but for advice on matters far beyond plantation affairs, a reliance that unsettled many of his peers. The weekly poker games, however, were the true stage where power and pride played out. Judge Cornelius Petton, whose family had helped shape Virginia's Constitution and whose rulings carried immense influence, was a permanent fixture at the table. Dr. Samuel Fitzgerald, the physician whose practice spanned nearly every wealthy family in the county, brought both caution and insight, always observing more than he revealed. And then there was Marcus Bogard, the newest member of their circle. A man who had drifted up from Charleston with inherited wealth, a polished education, and a reputation for gambling that blended charm with menace. For 2 years, these men had gathered in Harrison's study every Thursday evening, bourbon in hand and cigars smoldering their games, escalating from harmless wagers to fortunes lost and won in a single hand. But money was never the real prize. Each dealt hand was a contest of dominance, a way of testing nerves and egos among men who defined themselves by control. By 1847, tensions ran deeper than the cards. Tobacco markets were unstable. Whispers of northern hostility toward slavery were growing louder, and southern leaders argued over whether bondage could expand westward. To admit uncertainty was to admit weakness, so planters carried their doubts silently, masking them with bravado in games like these. On the night of March 18th, the rain had been steady since morning, pattering against the tall windows of Thorngate Manor as if marking time. Harrison's study radiated wealth and authority. Mahogany polished to a shine, leather-bound volumes stacked neatly on the walls, a marble fireplace blazing with seasoned oak. Caesar prepared the room with quiet precision, arranging the green felt table, laying fresh decks by his master's hand, and filling crystal decanters with brandy and bourbon. Yet something in his manner that night felt different, an extra care in his movements, a measured pause when his eyes lingered on certain objects, as if he knew more about what was coming than anyone else. Judge Petton arrived first, shaking the rain from his coat, grumbling about the muddy roads, his presence lending the gathering the authority of Virginia's elite. Dr. Fitzgerald followed his medical bag, always close at hand, his watchful eyes as alert at the card table as they were in the sick room. Then Marcus Bogard entered, and the atmosphere shifted. At 39, Marcus carried himself with a confidence that made others wary, magnetic, unsettling, impossible to ignore. His years of study in Charleston and New Orleans had taught him the fine arts of both persuasion and deception. And though his fortune seemed bottomless, its origins remained as shadowy as the man himself. "Gentlemen," he declared with a smile, as he sank into his chair, "I trust you're ready for an evening worth remembering. Luck has been kind to me lately." Harrison began to deal while Caesar moved silently about, feeding the fire and refilling glasses, the unspoken witness to a night that would mark the turning point in all their lives. The night had started harmless enough. The first hands passed with the usual chatter about crops, politics, and county rumors, the pots modest, the atmosphere familiar. But as the bourbon flowed and the hours dragged on, the balance in the room began to shift. Marcus had been losing steadily, his frustration showing in sharper movements and bolder bets. Those who knew him could sense the storm building. Judge Petton, cautious as always, folded more often than not, preferring to watch from the sidelines. Dr. Fitzgerald kept to his measured style, scooping up small pots and avoiding any real risk. Harrison, meanwhile, seemed blessed by fortune itself, his hands strong, his winnings mounting. By the time the clock struck 10, he was ahead nearly $800, enough to fund a small farm or cover a year's wages for many families. It was then that Marcus leaned forward, his voice smooth, his shuffle steady, and suggested a final hand. "One game winner take all." But not just money. Something more. His words froze the room. Judge Petton peered over his spectacles, wary. Fitzgerald frowned, skeptical. Even Caesar, moving quietly about the room, paused mid-step. Marcus, eyes gleaming, placed his own stake on the table first, his Charleston properties, including a rice plantation and a grand home on East Bay Street, worth more than $15,000. The sum was staggering. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the rain hammering the windows and the hiss of the fire. Fitzgerald protested at once, insisting no one could match such a wager. Marcus only smiled and told them they were thinking too small. Petton could wager his legal practice, Fitzgerald his plantation and medical practice, and Harrison could offer the most valuable stake of all, his daughter's hand in marriage. The suggestion sucked the air from the room. Caesar froze at the decanter, his face tightening. Petton paled, visibly shaken, while Fitzgerald audibly gasped. Harrison nearly laughed it off as drunken bravado, but Marcus's stare held him in place. In their world, a man's authority was measured by his ability to command his family's destiny. Refusing such a wager might be seen as weakness. Petton tried to intervene, insisting Marcus had gone too far, that a young woman's life wasn't property. Marcus countered coldly, weren't most marriages already arranged for money and status? At least this way, he argued, fate would be decided at the table, not behind closed doors. Against his better judgment, Harrison found himself considering it. Margaret was his pride, the key to securing alliances that would elevate the Rutherford name even higher. Yet under the law, she was his to promise as he pleased. And then, like a knife in the dark, Marcus revealed his counteroffer. If Harrison pledged Margaret, Marcus would wager Caesar. The study erupted. Petton pushed back from the table so abruptly, his chair nearly toppled. His face flushed with outrage. Fitzgerald's hand shook around his glass, and Caesar, the man at the center of it all, stood frozen in the lamplight, the weight of the unthinkable hanging in the air. Fitzgerald started to object, but Marcus silenced him with a raised hand. "Think it through," he said smoothly. "Caesar isn't just another laborer. He's Harrison's greatest asset outside the land itself. His knowledge, his numbers, his influence over the estate, losing him would cripple Thorngate more than any drought or bad harvest ever could." His words cut straight to the truth. Harrison realized with a chill that Marcus had been watching far more closely than anyone had guessed. Caesar was more than a bookkeeper. He was a confidant, an intellectual equal, a man whose insights had sharpened Harrison's own mind and made the plantation thrive. To lose him would be to lose a piece of himself. But to win, to secure Caesar permanently along with Margaret's future, would prove his dominance beyond question. Caesar stood by the brandy table, outwardly composed, but trembling faintly as he held the decanter. They were speaking of him as though he were no more than livestock. Yet the law gave him no voice in the matter. "Gentlemen," Harrison said finally, steadying his tone, "this will be a game remembered long after we're gone." Judge Petton made one last appeal, warning that no hand of cards should decide the fate of lives. But Harrison's pride, his bourbon-fueled bravado, and the lure of power silenced reason. Fitzgerald sat transfixed, torn between outrage and the fascination of watching social boundaries dissolve in real time. For him, it was almost clinical, an experiment in human behavior, carried out at the highest stakes imaginable. Marcus began to shuffle, each motion crisp and deliberate, the cards snapping in the lamplight like a drumbeat. "5-card stud," he declared. "One hand. Winner takes all." "The terms are clear." Harrison swallowed hard and nodded. "If I win, Margaret remains mine, and Caesar becomes my legal property. If you win, you take Margaret's hand, but Caesar stays with me." Marcus's smile was thin, triumphant. "Exactly. With one addition, Caesar deals the hand." The word stunned the room. To let an enslaved man shuffle and deal cards in a wager of this magnitude was unheard of. Yet Marcus twisted it into logic. Who could be more impartial? His very life is on the table. He has every reason to be fair. Caesar accepted the deck, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped forward. The irony was brutal. The man whose fate was being gambled away would decide the outcome with each flick of the cards. Harrison watched closely as Caesar began to deal slow and measured his expression unreadable. For the first time, Harrison thought he glimpsed something unexpected in Caesar's gaze, not fear, but calculation. Cold, deliberate calculation. The game unfolded like a slow-motion disaster, each card tightening the noose around Harrison's neck. His whole card, the 10 of hearts coupled with the king of spades showing, gave him an early advantage. When the king of hearts followed, he revealed a powerful pair enough to make his chest swell with confidence. Marcus, on the other hand, had the jack of diamonds, and soon drew the queen of diamonds, hinting at a dangerous straight draw. Caesar's voice, steady despite the tremor in his hands, announced the bets. Harrison pressed his edge, sliding $500 forward, a staggering sum, even for men of their wealth. Marcus matched him, without blinking, his eyes locked on Harrison's. The third round raised the tension to a breaking point. Harrison pulled the 10 of spades, kings, and tens, a formidable two-pair. Marcus drew the 10 of diamonds, and with his jack and queen, the whisper of a straight began to hang in the air. Harrison shoved the last of his money into the center, more than $300. "All in," he declared. Marcus answered with that unnerving, icy smile. "Call." The final face-up card broke the room apart. Harrison drew the king of clubs, giving him a crushing full house. Kings over tens, one of the strongest hands a man could hope for. Relief and triumph surged through him so intensely, he almost laughed. But Marcus drew the 9 of diamonds. Together with the 10 Jack and Queen of diamonds already on the table, Marcus now held 4 cards to a straight flush. Only one card could complete it, the 8 of diamonds. The room went dead still. Even the rain outside seemed to hush. Judge Petton's knuckles whitened on his chair. Dr. Fitzgerald sat stiff, unable to breathe. Harrison tried to calculate the odds. They were infinitesimal. Surely fortune wouldn't betray him now. Caesar's voice, calm but heavy, cut through the silence. "Gentlemen, reveal your whole cards." Harrison flipped his 10 of hearts, confirming his full house. He forced his voice to sound steady, kings over 10s. It should have been enough to crush any opponent. Marcus lingered, letting the silence choke the air, then turned over his card. The 8 of diamonds, a straight flush. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It was the silence of a world broken open, of power undone in an instant. Harrison's full house, a hand strong enough to win nearly every game, meant nothing. His daughter's future, his pride, his legacy had been lost to the fall of a single card. When Marcus finally spoke, his words were quiet, but their authority was absolute. "Gentlemen, I believe we have a winner." The hours that followed blurred into dread. Petton left in stunned silence. Fitzgerald lingered only long enough to pour another drink before stumbling into the storm. Harrison sat alone at the table, the fire burned down to embers, staring at the cards as if they might reverse themselves. Caesar stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, caught between 2 worlds. On paper, he now belonged to Marcus, yet until the legal documents were drawn up, he remained at Thorngate, a man suspended in limbo. At last Caesar spoke. "Master Harrison, what will you tell Miss Margaret?" His voice carried both respect and accusation. Harrison lifted his head, and Caesar was stunned to see tears tracing his face. In all their years of working side by side through markets rising and collapsing, through family deaths and crises, Harrison Rutherford had never once wept. Now he whispered brokenly, "I don't know. How do you tell your daughter you've gambled away her future to a man she's never even spoken to?" The law was merciless. Virginia gave fathers absolute authority over their daughters' marriages until they reached 21 or wed. With Judge Petton and Dr. Fitzgerald as witnesses, the wager was legally binding. But the law was only part of the noose. Word of the wager, once it escaped into the county's tight social circles, would be ruinous. Harrison would not simply lose his daughter, he would lose his standing, his respect, perhaps even the Rutherford name itself. The notion that a father could gamble away his daughter's future cut straight to the core of what society believed about paternal duty, honor and order. For generations, men like Harrison Rutherford had been the guardians of family legacy, their word law within their households. Yet, in a single night, Harrison had overturned that sacred trust. Marcus Bogard left Thorngate Manor with a handshake that carried the appearance of sympathy, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed a different truth. This was not chance. It was design. He had walked into that room with an outcome already scripted in his mind. When morning light spilled across the plantation, Harrison emerged from the study, hollow-eyed to face a duty he dreaded more than any financial ruin, telling Margaret. He found her in the morning room, pale sunlight catching in her auburn hair as she read poetry over breakfast. She looked up at once, startled by his haggard appearance. "Papa, you look dreadful." "Were you up all night at cards?" Harrison sat opposite her, drinking in her features with the weight of a man who knew he was about to betray the daughter he cherished. At just 18, Margaret embodied everything her lineage demanded. Beauty, intellect, grace, qualities that should have secured her a marriage of stature and her own choosing. Instead, her future had been gambled into the hands of a near stranger. "Margaret," he began faltering, his throat locked around the words. She pressed him. "Papa, You're frightening me. What's happened?" So he told her. He tried to soften the edges, to frame it as a game born of confidence and custom, to explain that in their world, marriages were often arranged like business contracts. But as the story unspooled, Margaret's face hardened, shifting from disbelief to a fury so cold and precise, it reminded him chillingly of Marcus himself. When he finished, the silence was suffocating. Sunlight caught her hair like flame, her eyes fixed on him with a clarity sharper than any blade. At last, she spoke, her voice calm but deadly. "So let me understand. You wagered my marriage against Caesar's freedom, and you lost." Harrison stammered about the strength of his hand, the astronomical odds. She cut him off. "I don't care about odds. You had no right." He tried to justify himself with law and custom, repeating that fathers held absolute authority until their daughters were wed. But the words sounded brittle, even as he spoke them. Margaret rose from the table, her untouched breakfast left behind. "When does Master Wagered plan to collect his prize?" The venom she packed into that single word made Harrison wince. "This afternoon," he admitted weakly. "We must discuss the practical arrangements." Her laugh was bitter empty. "How thoughtful of you both to consider the practical arrangements of my bondage." She turned and left him, her silence more damning than any curse. At 2 o'clock sharp, Marcus Wagered returned. He arrived dressed like a man attending his own coronation, silk waistcoat, gleaming polished boots clicking on the stone steps. At his side was a thin, jittery lawyer from Richmond named Silas Crawford, a satchel stuffed with documents clutched in his hand. Harrison greeted them in the study, where it had all unraveled the night before. The cards and chips were gone, but the smell of bourbon and smoke clung to the air, seeping from the walls like ghosts of the night's sins. Marcus lowered himself into his chair with casual ease. "Harrison, my dear friend," he said smoothly, "I trust you've had time to reflect on our new arrangement." Harrison's reply was flat bitter. "I've had time to regret it." Marcus smiled that cold smile again and reminded Harrison that a gentleman honors his debts. Then Mr. Crawford spread a stack of documents across the table, marriage contracts, transfer papers for Caesar, and every legal form anyone could imagine. Harrison felt a chill because the papers were immaculate. Every contingency covered proof that Marcus had not stumbled on luck, but had plotted this outcome long before the cards were dealt. Harrison protested that Margaret would resist, and Marcus replied with easy condescension that spirited young women could be persuaded in time, and if not, the law gave Harrison absolute authority until she came of age. Caesar entered with a tea service, his steps quieter now, a resigned dignity about him that made the room feel like a stage set for something awful and inevitable. He told them that Miss Margaret wished to speak, and despite Marcus's slight amusement, Harrison felt his stomach drop. Margaret came in wearing a deep blue gown and an expression that made the room go cold, poised as if she were taking the high seat in a courtroom, rather than answering a summons in her own home. She greeted Marcus with polite words that barely hid the steel beneath, then laid out the terms she would accept. She would honor the legal obligations, she would marry to satisfy law and custom. She would live in his house and bear the outward title of his wife. But she made one thing absolutely clear. She would never willingly share his bed. She would never bear his children, and every day of their married life, she would make him regret the moment he sat down to gamble. The lawyer went pale. Marcus as calm. Veneer cracked and for the first time showed real anger as he tried to insist that marriage carried duties, both legal and moral. But Margaret answered not with pleading, but with cold resolve, articulating how she would turn every duty into a weapon against him. How ownership on paper would not give him possession. In fact, how she would be a presence in his house that would haunt his triumph. Caesar watched near the doorway, and Harrison could see something like approval in the enslaved man's eyes. A small acknowledgement that Margaret had taken the only stance that preserved her will in a world that had tried to sell it. The afternoon ended with documents signed under the weight of law and custom, but with a new kind of defeat written into the arrangement, for Marcus had gained a title while losing the thing he thought he wanted most, and the Rutherford household had been altered forever by a wager that bought nothing but ruin. Margaret's voice cut through Marcus's rising anger like steel wrapped in silk. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said, her calmness more unnerving than a shout. "You may drag me into marriage, but you cannot make me happy in it. And an unhappy wife, Master Wagered, can make her husband's life a living torment." Her words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Just when it seemed the nightmare could sink no deeper, the sound of wheels crunching gravel broke the tension. Judge Petton's carriage had arrived. Moments later, the door swung open, and the old jurist entered without ceremony, his face drawn and pale, an official-looking document clutched in his hand. "Harrison, Marcus?" His voice carried the weight of judgment. "We have a problem." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Petton scanned the room, the marriage contracts laid out like weapons on the poker table, Margaret standing tall in her blue gown, Caesar silent by the door, and the severity in his expression silenced everyone. Harrison rose quickly. "Cornelius, what's happened?" Petton's voice hardened. "What's happened is that last night's little game has already reached Richmond. This morning I received a writ from the Attorney General's office, an inquiry into irregular gambling involving human property and what they're calling coercive marriage contracts." Marcus's face drained of color. "That's impossible." How could they know Petton cut him off lifting the writ? Because someone told them. Someone who was there. Someone who grasped exactly what the law would make of this madness. Every gaze turned toward Caesar. He stood as he had all morning, still dignified, but now there was the faintest flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Harrison's voice cracked in disbelief. You reported us." Caesar met his master's stare without flinching. "Master Harrison, you taught me letters. You taught me accounts, contracts, the weight of law. Did you truly believe I wouldn't understand what last night meant?" The words struck like a physical blow. Marcus leapt to his feet, his polished mask shattering. "You treacherous," Caesar's calm voice cut across him. "Careful, Master Wagered. You may hold a bill of sale, but the law of Virginia still forbids you from striking me in anger before witnesses. Even now, the Attorney General's eye is on you." Judge Petton collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. "Caesar, what exactly did you tell them?" Caesar's tone was measured, almost clinical. "That 4 of Virginia's most prominent men wagered human lives in a card game. That a young woman's marriage was treated as property. That a contract was drafted under duress, violating both common law and moral order. I described the game, the stakes, and the agreements in full. And I swore testimony that Miss Margaret was being coerced." The lawyer Silas Crawford went white and began rifling through his documents with trembling hands. This could void everything. If the Attorney General rules that the game was unlawful if it constitutes human trafficking, Margaret's voice cut cleanly across the panic. "Which it does." She turned toward Caesar, her expression blazing with admiration. "You brilliant, wonderful man." Harrison sat stunned, his entire world shifting beneath him. "But why Caesar? If this goes forward, if they truly investigate, you could be punished as well." Caesar did not lower his gaze. "Perhaps. But sometimes punishment is a price worth paying to break a system built on injustice. And last night, gentlemen, you broke it yourselves. Enslaved people who accused their masters risked brutal consequences, and Caesar acknowledged that risk, but he also said he had reached his limit. While dealing the cards, he realized he was tired of being property, and if punishment came for speaking truth, he wanted that truth to matter. So he reported the game to the Attorney General and sent the story to 3 newspaper editors, and suddenly, the room that had felt like a private theater turned into a trap. No amount of money or influence could close. Marcus paced and raged. Judge Peyton warned that Caesar had created a danger that could destroy them all. And Dr. Fitzgerald pleaded for a quiet resolution. But the combination of a formal inquiry and impending headlines meant this scandal would not stay local. Caesar stood in the study and explained that Harrison had taught him to read contracts and accounts, that he had been learning law and politics through correspondence, and that he knew how to use documentation and publicity to force a reckoning. By involving the Attorney General and the press, he had turned a closed circle of gentlemen into a public case, and any attempt to bury the matter would itself become a scandal. The charges now under consideration were grave and criminal. Not merely social embarrassments, human trafficking, coercive marriage contracts, conspiracy to violate gambling laws, crimes that could lead to prison. And Judge Peyton admitted the implications were far worse than he had first feared. Harrison sat with the sudden knowledge that everything he had built was at stake. The plantation, his reputation, his political ties, and even his relationship with Margaret, whose alliance with Caesar had become obvious and unsettling to the men who had assumed they controlled every outcome. Dr. Fitzgerald Cornelius and Silas Crawford, the lawyer, scrambled through legal options, but Caesar remained composed, looking out at the fields where people he considered kin labored, and he said plainly that he had been taught all he needed to bring them down, that their own trust and arrogance had handed him the tools to expose them. And in that moment, the true horror for the county was not a single cruel wager, but the collapse of a system that had always relied on silence. Judge Peyton's words cut through the room with grim finality. Because they were men of prominence, he explained the case would attract extraordinary attention. The Attorney General could not be seen shielding wealthy planters whose behavior offended even the rigid standards of Virginia society. Marcus stopped his restless pacing and turned toward Caesar, his voice tight with desperation. "What do you want? Money, freedom? Tell me what you'll take in exchange for withdrawing your report." Caesar's reply landed like a hammer. "Master Bogard, you still don't understand. I didn't report this crime to bargain. I reported it because it was a crime. The only thing I want is justice." The word hung in the study like a curse, shocking in its defiance. For an enslaved man to speak of justice as something he could claim for himself was revolutionary, yet Caesar had already proved he knew how to wield the law as a weapon. "It is too late for negotiations," he continued, calm but unyielding. "The letters are gone. The investigation has begun. By tomorrow, everyone in Richmond, Charleston, and Washington will know what happened here. The damage is already done." Margaret stepped closer to Caesar, her eyes bright with tears. "You saved me," she whispered. "You saved us both." Caesar shook his head gently. "No, Miss Margaret. You would have saved yourself in time. You have your mother's fire. I only provided the law." The papers spread across the poker table no longer looked like contracts, but damning evidence. Marcus reached instinctively for the marriage agreement, but Judge Peyton's sharp voice stopped him cold. "Don't touch them. They're evidence now. Tampering would mean obstruction of justice." Harrison finally spoke, his voice hollow. "What happens now?" Peyton straightened, his tone heavy with inevitability. "Now we wait. The Attorney General's investigators will want to question each of us, examine every document, collect every witness account. It could take weeks, even months. And until then, all agreements from the game are suspended. Margaret cannot be forced into marriage. Caesar cannot be transferred. Nothing stands until this inquiry is complete. Marcus's face twisted with outrage. This is madness. I won that hand fairly. Margaret turned on him with icy calm. You won a hand that treated human lives as chips. In what world did you think that was fair? Before Marcus could respond, the sound of wheels and hooves filled the air outside. Several carriages bearing the seal of the Commonwealth were pulling up to Thorngate Manor. Through the tall windows, liveried officials could be seen disembarking. The investigators had arrived far earlier than anyone expected. Judge Peaton rose, adjusting his coat with weary dignity. Gentlemen, he said gravely, we had better prepare ourselves. This will be the most difficult legal ordeal of our lives. What followed became legend in Virginia's hidden history. For 3 relentless weeks, Attorney General investigators descended upon Thorngate. They questioned everyone connected to the poker game, scrutinized plantation ledgers, and gathered testimony from across Pennsylvania County. At the head of the inquiry was Catherine Henley, one of the first women to serve as a legal clerk in Virginia. Her sharp mind and uncompromising methods ensured that nothing would be swept quietly under the rug. The scandal that began with a card game would grow into a storm powerful enough to haunt the county for generations. Catherine Henley's presence electrified the inquiry, not only because she was one of the first women to serve in such a role, but because her sharp questions cut deeper than any of the men expected. What began as an investigation into a single poker game quickly became an indictment of the entire social order that had made such a wager conceivable. Her first interrogation of Harrison lasted more than 6 hours and left him visibly broken. She dismantled his defenses piece by piece, forcing him to confront truths he had long buried beneath pride and bourbon. At one point she asked, with merciless calm, Master Rutherford, how does a father justify gambling his daughter's future happiness on the fall of a card? Was it arrogance, desperation, or indifference to her life? Harrison could not answer, and that silence followed him for the rest of his days. If Harrison's interview revealed guilt and shame, Caesar's testimony provided the prosecution with its sharpest weapon. Calm, articulate, and devastatingly precise, he spoke not only of the poker game, but of the wider system that had allowed it to happen. Master Rutherford did not wager his daughter out of love for the game, Caesar testified under oath. He did it because losing her would demonstrate his absolute power, the power to decide another person's fate on a whim. And Master Bogard was not seeking a wife. He was seeking total ownership. Caesar's words transformed the case from a scandal into a moral reckoning. The investigation unearthed even darker truths about Marcus Bogard. Financial records from Charleston tied him to illicit slave trading ventures and fraudulent land deals, suggesting his move to Virginia had been less about opportunity and more about escaping indictments back home. Worse still, reports from Charleston and Savannah revealed that this was not his first attempt to secure a wife through gambling. The Thorngate incident was part of a patterned predatory behavior cloaked in wealth and charm, tolerated for years by officials dazzled by his fortune. Judge Peaton's involvement pushed the scandal into uncharted territory. As both a participant and a sitting judge, his presence created a constitutional crisis. The Attorney General's office brought in special prosecutors from neighboring states to avoid accusations of bias. The fallout rippled into the legislature, which convened emergency sessions that eventually produced new laws regulating gambling and strengthening protections against coerced marriage contracts. Peaton, once admired for progressive rulings, now faced ruin, his reputation collapsing under the weight of betrayal and hypocrisy. Dr. Fitzgerald fared slightly better, though not without cost. His role in the game was less predatory, and when confronted, he chose to cooperate fully with investigators. His testimony corroborated Caesar's account and helped prove Marcus's actions had been planned well in advance. In exchange for reduced charges, Fitzgerald sacrificed his social standing and professional reputation. For a man once considered the trusted physician of the county elite, the humiliation was profound. By the end of the inquiry, Thorngate Manor was no longer simply the scene of a reckless poker game. It had become the epicenter of a scandal that exposed the fragility of Virginia's planter aristocracy, a reminder that beneath the polished surface of wealth and tradition lay corruption, arrogance, and a hunger for power that could destroy even the most respected names. Dr. Fitzgerald paid a steep price for his cooperation. His medical practice, once trusted across the county, withered as patients questioned his judgment and moral integrity. Prominent families began requesting other physicians, and although he avoided prison, his reputation never recovered. He lived out the remainder of his life in quiet obscurity, remembered less for his healing skills than for his role in the infamous Thorngate scandal. The newspapers that Caesar had reached out to were just as damning as the courts. Editorials spread across Richmond, Charleston, and Washington dissected the affair not simply as a gambling dispute, but as a symbol of deeper corruption. Writers asked hard questions about the moral foundation of Southern society, about a culture where gentlemen could wager human beings with the same casualness as betting on a horse race. One editorial in the Richmond Enquirer struck especially hard, asking, "If fathers can gamble away their daughters' futures for sport, what protections remain for any woman in our Commonwealth?" By spring of 1848, the case concluded with devastating outcomes. Marcus Bogard, exposed as a fraud and predator, was convicted of conspiracy to commit human trafficking. He received a 10-year sentence and crippling fines, and the court stripped him of the right to own property in Virginia. He lasted only 3 years behind bars before dying of pneumonia, though many suspected his enemies in prison had hastened his end. Harrison Rutherford escaped criminal conviction, but could not escape ruin. The civil penalties, legal fees, and shattered alliances bled him dry. He lost his political standing. Many of his business partnerships collapsed, and the Rutherford name became a byword for scandal. Plantations that had once employed nearly 200 enslaved people were stripped down to fewer than 50 by 1850. Harrison lived on, but carried the humiliation like a brand, his daughter's cold rejection sealing the final fracture in his legacy. Judge Cornelius Peyton resigned in disgrace, retreating to a small private practice where he handled minor civil disputes. The jurist who once helped shape Virginia's Constitution now died in 1852, broken and disgraced his family, whispering that his heart had failed from the weight of shame. Caesar's fate was the most complex of all. The investigation had nullified his transfer to Marcus. But Virginia law offered no path to freedom for an enslaved man who aided prosecutors. He existed in a strange limbo, admired in the press, but still legally bound. The breakthrough came from Margaret Rutherford. On her 21st birthday in 1850, she used the inheritance from her mother's estate to purchase Caesar's freedom. The transaction was conducted publicly with newspapers present, ensuring Harrison could not intervene. Margaret's act was more than a personal gesture. It was a public declaration that she rejected her father's choices and the rotten system that had allowed the poker game to happen. Caesar walked free not because of Harrison's grudging respect, nor because of a loophole in the law, but because Margaret claimed her own authority and used it to undo, at least in part, the shame her father had created. In that moment, Thorngate Manor's darkest legacy was also the stage for an act of quiet defiance that would echo for generations. The ceremony where Caesar Wellington was formally granted his freedom became more than a legal transaction, it was a spectacle. Dozens of abolitionists and reform-minded citizens attended, turning it into a symbolic victory for those who opposed slavery. Margaret Rutherford herself orchestrated the event, using it not only to free Caesar, but also to reject every suitor who had courted her in the wake of the scandal. She never married, instead channeling her energy into what would later be recognized as the early women's rights movement in Virginia. As one of the state's first female property owners, she became a fearless voice for legal reform. Her actions directly challenging the authority structures that had once defined her as little more than her father's asset. Caesar now free, and Margaret formed a partnership that was both professional and deeply symbolic. Together they built business ventures in the 1850s that defied convention, forcing Virginia society to grapple with a planter's daughter and a formerly enslaved man working side by side. Meanwhile, the story of the poker game itself never stopped circulating. Parents warned their sons against gambling with it as a cautionary tale, while reformers used it to demonstrate the moral rot at the heart of slavery. The details twisted with each retelling, but the essence endured. Arrogance and cruelty could topple even the most powerful men. The Rutherford plantation limped on, but never regained its former glory. Harrison Rutherford survived until 1863, dying on the eve of the Civil War. A broken man cut off from his friends, estranged from his daughter, and haunted by what he had done. Margaret's last words to him, witnessed by servants and visitors alike, cut as deep as any judgment. "Papa, do you ever regret that poker game?" His whispered reply, "I regret everything that led to it and everything that followed." After his death, the study where the game had been played was sealed. Later, owners swore the room carried strange echoes, shuffling cards, low voices arguing whether tricks of sound or something darker. The house itself seemed unwilling to let the memory go. Legally, the case established what came to be known as the Caesar Wellington precedent. For the first time in Virginia, the law recognized protections for witnesses who reported crimes committed by their superiors, even enslaved witnesses. It also led to reforms that chipped away at fathers' absolute authority over their daughters' marriages. And most importantly, it proved that the same legal codes meant to uphold slavery could be turned with intelligence and courage into tools of resistance. Artifacts from the scandal documents, contracts, even the deck of cards were eventually preserved by the Virginia Historical Society. The worn playing cards, still bearing the fingerprints of the men who handled them, remain on display as stark reminders of how one reckless wager unraveled a dynasty. The story's final twist came in 1865, when Caesar Wellington published his memoir. From Property to Person, My Journey from Slavery to Freedom. The book became a Northern bestseller, praised for its eloquence and psychological insight. In it, Caesar revealed the most shocking secret of all, that he had deliberately manipulated the deal on that fateful night. By ensuring Marcus Bogart's victory, Caesar had guaranteed that the scandal would explode into something too outrageous to suppress. Sometimes, he wrote, justice requires us to let evil defeat itself. Only then will others be forced to see the trap they have built. The tale of the Thorngate poker game endures as one of Virginia's darkest mysteries, a story of arrogance, betrayal, and rebellion that still leaves lingering questions. Was everything truly revealed, or do more secrets remain buried in the archives of Pennsylvania County? If this story unsettled you, share it with a fellow history lover. Subscribe for more accounts of horror in the past, and remember, the shadows of history are full of secrets, still waiting to be uncovered.